Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. March 1927's follow-ups will take us to two main regions. We'll start in the upper Midwest, and we will cover stories in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and North Dakota, including college co-ed bank robber number 2. Then we'll make our way for warmer winter climates and head to Texas and Oklahoma, where we will revisit college co-ed bank robber number 1. And since we're in Oklahoma, of course, we'll have another violent encounter with Matt Kimes. You want crazy, you want violent, you can't handle the truth. The March 1, 1927 Bismarck Tribune starts us off on page 3, but it boasts two stories that kind of cross over to the Rochester, Minnesota heist that we covered back in December of 1926, along with the New Rockford, North Dakota heist that we covered in September of 1926. The title was Men Charged with Participation in Rochester Robbery, which came to us from Chicago, where we see a Tony Serpa, who was 43 or 45, a Frank Raymond, who was 67 or 69, and also known as Doc Reed, a Robert L. Hurd, who was probably more likely Robert L. Hayward, 43, Big Dave Earsman, no, we don't know his age at the time, and John Crawford, who was about 40. We have a little sidebar here on John Shinner Crawford. That's Hinner. We introduced John Shinner Crawford in our February 1927 follow-up video. He'd just been arrested, and his crime record was the one that went back to 1902, meaning 1/4 of a century of crime to that point. Anyway, Rochester, Minnesota officers were on their way to the Windy City for the extradition of a trio out of the 5 that we mentioned above. Recall that the Olmsted County Bank was hit for $30,000, during which 2 police officers were shot. We covered this early December heist in our December 1926 main story episode. According to police, the 3 were also sought by government agents at St. Louis, Missouri on charges of defrauding by mail. Just a couple columns away ran a story, Bank Robbers May Be in Jail. It was subtitled 5 Men Arrested in Chicago, Believed to Have Staged Series of Holdups. Well, this second story comes to us courtesy of the AP, Associated Press, and it's partitioned into 2 parts, part of it from New Rockford, North Dakota, with a separate installment out of Chicago. So the first story, only one of the 5 men under arrest in Chicago was suspected of being implicated in the first national bank heist of New Rockford, North Dakota. This is according to Louis Mortensen, who was the president of that bank. Photographs of John Shinner Crawford were also forwarded to New Rockford for identification, if possible, by bank employees, those who'd actually been held up at the time. That was the first story. The second story noted that the quintet was suspected of holdups in Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, and Michigan, with a total of over $200,000 being stolen. And they clarified that it was 2, not 3, who were wanted in St. Louis for mail fraud in what was called a confidence game. So again, the first who was arrested was John Shinner Crawford. He was arrested on February 28th. On that evening of February 28th, 3 more were arrested. That included Serpa, Raymond, and who I'm going to go with as Hayward. 1 surrendered on the morning of March 1st. So that leaves Big Dave Earsman. But the question at this point is, did he actually go in and surrender or kind of inadvertently dupe himself? Well, representatives of both the Minnesota and the Wisconsin Bankers Associations arrived in Chicago and had state warrants for the 5. So they were each after this quintet. That included A.M. Dvorsny of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Charles D. Brown of Minneapolis, Minnesota. The latter, Brown, declared that all 5 had been positively identified as those who raided the First National Bank of Columbus, Wisconsin back in September of 1926 for $135,000. They were also being looked at for the robberies at the Bank of Brodhead, Wisconsin for $16,000 back on August 6 of 1926. The First National Bank of New Rockford, North Dakota for $60,000 September 30, 1926, and even back to 1925 with the State Bank of Excelsior, Minnesota for $10,000 in October of 25. They were also believed to be responsible for the First National Bank at Dowagiac, Michigan for $40,000 back in November of 1926. And note, we covered the Bank of Brodhead, First National Bank of New Rockford, and this First National Bank at Dowagiac, Michigan in various 1926 episodes. And of course, they were also going to be questioned regarding the Olmsted County Bank for $30,000 that was perpetrated recently in our study, December 4, 1926. All 5, of course, were going to fight extradition. In fact, Crawford had already filed a writ of habeas corpus and was set to appear in court regarding that writ on Saturday, March 5th. In the case that the extradition did go through, they were expected to be returned to Minnesota first, since Minnesota authorities were the first to work on the case. Then they would go to Wisconsin to be tried, and lastly to Michigan. A.M. Dvorsny provided us a nice summary of the bank combine's actions and their tactics, how they went about robbing a bank, and he used the Columbus, Wisconsin holdup as the model. What would happen would be Big Dave Earsman would kind of scope the bank out. So at Columbus, he watched the bank for several days from across the street at a bakery. He studied the number of people who went in and out, when people came and went, with details. Somehow, a record sheet was stolen from the bank, which showed amounts of bonds and cash that had been received. So they knew basically how much was there. The holdup then followed shortly. Well, the Bismarck Tribune followed up with a March 2nd, 1927 story titled, New Burglary Charge Placed Against Serpa, and it was subtitled, One of 5 Alleged Bank Robbers Wanted for Robbery of Clothing Store. We learned that Champaign, Illinois detective Dwight Lyons was making the trek to Chicago with a warrant for Serpa. Serpa was wanted for looting a store of dresses, coats, and stock certificates valued at a total of $27,000. Well, it turned out that Dvorsny and Brown headed back to their respective states to get witnesses to come and attend the habeas corpus hearing for Crawford, and they brought more because they anticipated that the other 4 robbers would do the same and they would need witnesses. The Douglas Daily Dispatch picked up on the story and noted that this quintet, this combine, was, quote, one of the most methodical which ever operated in the Northwest, end quote. Their total haul was up to $350,000 at a minimum and possibly up to $500,000. Well, and according to the Dispatch, Big Dave Earsman was, in fact, the gang leader. And when he went to the Detective Bureau to inquire about Shinner Crawford, that's when he was arrested. The details don't quite match up with that of the Bismarck Tribune's, meaning these timelines are kind of off of when someone was arrested, when they went to visit, and so forth. So, for example, according to the Douglas Daily Dispatch, after checking on Crawford and inadvertently getting himself arrested, detectives had gleaned enough information from Earsman and Crawford to then go to an apartment and arrest the other 3. So that's it for the Douglas Daily Dispatch. We'll turn back to what is possibly the more reliable Bismarck Tribune and its March 5, 1927 edition. Titled Bank Robbers Hearing Set for March 16, the story was subtitled, If Extradition is Granted, Men Will Be Taken to Rochester, Minnesota. So orders were received in Chicago from Illinois Governor Len Small. It stopped warrants against 3 of the 5 who were being held for what was set to be a March 11 hearing in Springfield, Illinois. Because of that, the habeas corpus hearings set for March 5th were postponed to March 16th. They noted that Earsman was somehow out on a $500 bond, having been booked for disorderly conduct. Why on earth would the robbery gang leader be out on $500? Meanwhile, Crawford and Serpa were being held in county jail. Raymond and Hayward had been turned over to federal authorities. They clarified even more. Raymond was turned over to federal authorities for using the mail to defraud. Hayward, since he was an escaped convict from the federal penitentiary at Atlanta, Georgia. Well, it looks like it took all the way up to March 11 for the story to reach the Producers News in Plentywood, Montana. They rehashed most of the details from earlier, only adding an out-of-context paragraph about a description given by a specific witness for one particular heist that really doesn't help. We'll continue to follow up on this bank robbery quintet as details become available. But that does not mean that we're done with Minnesota. In fact, we will go back to 1925 and the robbery of the Anoka National Bank. We covered the aftermath of this story in the April 1926 Part 2 video. At the time, we learned that 4 men had entered not guilty pleas in an Atoka, Minnesota courtroom. 3 of them had been captured in Shreveport, Louisiana, while a 4th had been languishing in a Hennepin, Minnesota county jail for a couple of months. So we turn to the Askoff American and its March 24, 1927 edition, and we see a story titled Life Term for Robbery Upheld. The Minnesota State Supreme Court upheld the law that made robbery punishable by life imprisonment, meaning convictions and life sentences for Tom Colcord, Johnny Anderson, and Clarence Salmi were not considered cruel or unusual punishment. They had committed the heist of the Anoka National Bank way back on December 8, 1925, when they scored $11,500 and what turned out to be life sentences. And we remain up north in the upper Midwest and revisit Marian Meyers, our South Dakota college co-ed who ran the Vermilion, South Dakota bank heist caper that we just covered. The Evening Star ran a March 8, 1927 story titled Girl Plans to Enter Plea of Burglary. The story is subtitled Former Co-ed Expected to Admit Third Degree in Robbery of Bank. The AP story noted that the case was going to be called on Wednesday, March 9. Meyers was expected indeed to plead guilty, but apparently she needed her mother's consent to do so. And importantly, they noted that she recently was determined to be sane at the time of the heist attempt. Well, enter the Daily Worker, a paper we get a pro-labor, pro-communist perspective from, and honestly, usually with some added bite and a little bit of wit to their stories. And there's no difference here as they cover the Meyers case. Quote, the end does not always justify the means, but it came darned near it in the case of Marian Meyers, end quote, according to the author. Now, this is where they go slightly off the rails in terms of facts, but hey, they indicated that she was caught, quote, contemplating a bank robbery to pay her way through school, end quote. They noted that she'd been given a prison sentence of 30 days, which also isn't completely accurate. That was probably the duration of her being jailed and then held for observation while they decided whether or not she was sane or insane. According to the Daily Worker author, Meyers was, quote, sitting in the bank building with her burglar's kit, end quote, when she was caught. They summarized that, quote, 30 days for such an offense is not bad, end quote. And with characteristic bite and humor, they added, quote, the girl may have been suffering from a delusion that she was a bank president, end quote. So we'll have to wait, it looks like, for April or beyond to find out what sentence she gets. And recall that for third-degree burglary in South Dakota at the time, it was up to 15 years. But now it's time to head south for some heat, and Texas seems appropriate. We covered the San Antonio National Bank heist way back in February of 1926. And then we followed up in March with a possible connection to the notorious Hostetter brothers. They'd been on a string of criminal acts, including bank robberies at the time. They'd hightailed it out of Indiana, and it was a nationwide hunt for them. And they were erroneously thought to have been part of the San Antonio robbery. In April, we covered the San Antonio Bank heist in detail, including the reenactment that was done at the bank at the time using a host of recently arrested and accused robbers. One of those alleged robbers was Kenneth Smith, who was accused along with his brother Jack. And we'd addressed a possible connection in a June 1926 episode. Well, I'll be darned if a plain-looking Brownsville Herald story in March didn't catch my eye. It was titled Kenneth Smith Case Remanded. So it turned out that Smith's 15-year sentence had been reversed and remanded by the Court of Appeals. Why? The court found errors in how the testimony was introduced and that there was a failure of the court to charge on a specific count of the indictment, and held that the transcript of testimony was vague in naming persons identified by witnesses. So this sounds like a lot of technicalities for Kenneth Smith. So we're definitely going to have to keep our eyes open for more on Kenneth Smith, and then perhaps the other 5 who'd been convicted based on the new information and his release. But since we're in Texas and we've already revisited college co-ed number 2, let's revisit with Rebecca Bradley Rodgers, first in our hearts as female bank robbers. We covered her story in detail using 10 different papers with, I think, 17 total editions. The March 6, 1927 Evening Star ran a story titled Texas Woman Indicted in Robbery of Bank. It was subtitled Former University Student Freed on $5,000 Bond, trial set for March 14th. Rebecca Rodgers from Austin, Texas, had been charged with the robbery of the Farmers National Bank at Buda, Texas on December 11th, 1926. She was accompanied by her attorney and was released on the $5,000 bond pending the March 14th trial. The Imperial Valley Press ran its March 8, 1927 story from a different angle. Titled Girl Bandits Case Continued, the United Press story noted that a continuance was granted in her arson case. For a ridiculous amount of details, including on the arson angle, check out the video released December 14th titled Bank Robbery Babe versus Bank Robbery Brutes. Well, the Brownsville Herald then ran the tiniest, most innocent-looking one-liner under its overnight Texas news column. They surmised that Rebecca Bradley Rodgers would seek a continuance on Monday, March 14th because of her husband being, quote, at the point of death, end quote, according to her attorney. So, man, what a difference a couple of days makes. We turn to the Douglas Daily Dispatch and we see girl defendant in Texas bank robbery will plead insanity. Allegedly, the 21-year-old Rodgers was, quote, subject to periodical insanity, and that her husband, Otis Rodgers, is responsible for loading a pistol held in evidence, end quote. Those were just a couple of the nuggets that were going to be mined in court coming up, presumably in March 14th or so. Well, it seemed that her husband, the Amarillo, Texas lawyer and counsel for his wife, was suffering from tuberculosis, and that bringing him to court could prove fatal. This is important because the defense held that Otis Rodgers is the one who put cartridges in the gun that Rebecca later used in the heist. She claimed she was unaware that it was loaded. In addition, Otis Rodgers was going to be called to testify about these periodical bouts of insanity. Now, regarding her arson charge, that case was pending in Georgetown, Texas, for her allegedly burning a house near Round Rock, Texas. If you recall the story, a few days before the Buda, Texas heist, a girl entered that bank near Round Rock and tried to get everyone to stampede out of the bank because of this raging fire. The Cordell Dispatch, Brownsville Herald, and Seward Daily Gateway didn't offer anything new, but the New Britain Daily Herald's March 21st, 1927 edition did offer a more humane touch, titled, Mrs. Rodgers goes on trial today, accused of firing empty house. The story rehashed known details of the arson attempt and some of the robbery, but approached the Otis Rodgers plight as he, quote, left his bed at Amarillo, Texas to go to Austin, where the girl lived, to defend her, end quote. And the March 27, 1927 Cordell Dispatch offered up this photo retrospective and story titled, State Claimed Becky Rodgers Confessed to Robbery of Bank. Well, a few more details emerged. 1. Rodgers allegedly laughed at the fear that had been shown by the bank cashier and his assistant during the heist of the Buddha Bank. Recall that she did aim that gun at them. 2. Rodgers rushed to her aid, but apparently or allegedly collapsed shortly thereafter. And 3, quote, slim, brunette, and tiny, end quote. Rodgers was, quote, characterized by her former university professors as brilliant, end quote. Brilliant indeed. Is she manipulating public sentiment, or is she insane? Time will tell as more details emerge. Remaining in Texas, one more time, we engage with the Brownsville Herald's March 20, 1927 edition and its Hunt Convicts for Slayings story. And this takes us to the notorious Wild West town of Borger, Texas, where we see a J.H. Walker and an Ed Bailey being charged with murder in the connection with the 1 a.m. shooting of one Coke Buchanan, Borger night patrolman and possessor of a great Texas name. Strangely, in my estimation, they'd been released on $3,500 bonds after being arraigned before Justice of the Peace S.M. Spencer. However, they were later re-arrested when new evidence was uncovered and were subsequently taken to the county jail at Stinnett, according to the assistant county attorney, J.O. Cook. Cook said that 2 or 3 men escaped after the shooting, and though no further charges were filed, he declared from descriptions of those fleeing by Officer Neal, who was with Buchanan at the time of the shooting, that Ray Terrill was one of them. Terrill, who'd recently escaped from the Oklahoma penitentiary, and none other than regular, for us, Matthew Kimes, who'd escaped from an Oklahoma jail, probably the Sequoyah County Jail. And Assistant County Attorney J.O. Cook confirmed from Neal that Terrill and Kimes were both present during this shooting. If you know Matt Kimes or have seen him mentioned in some of our previous videos, you're not surprised. Well, we'll obviously have to keep following up and tracking Matthew Kimes and all the rest as more details emerge. Our next video will be the quick hitter style, and we'll meet an Indiana embezzler. We'll see a violent shootout in Baltimore. We'll come across a Secret Service agent or officer turned bad. We'll have yet another Texas heist, and the doozy of them all, we'll go to California and see a heist by a mummy. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Till next time.